Across the black vault of space, dying suns bled their final light upon Terra's broken crown, and ash fell like exhausted snow over palaces that once sang hymns older than memory itself. The vengeful spirit drifted in the void like a wounded leviathan, its hull scarred by wars that had raged longer than mortal minds could comprehend, while below the Great Crusade lay shattered like fragments of burned parchment scattered across cosmic winds. Vox echoes wandered the battlements of the imperial palace, repeating oaths that no longer believed in themselves, and even the machine temples seemed to genuflect beneath the weight of accumulated sorrow. The galaxy held its breath between heartbeats, between the turning of worlds, as if the very fabric of reality understood that this moment would echo through eternity. Stars flickered and died in distant systems, their light arriving like messages from a universe grown weary of its own immensity. We truly love and care for you, and we're honored to share this tale with you tonight. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Within the obsidian sanctum of his flagship, Horus Lupercal stood before a viewport that framed the dying galaxy beyond, his perfect features carved from marble that had learned to feel pain. The Warmaster's eyes reflected distant fire, and in their depths swirled the accumulated weight of choices that had seemed so clear when first made, now grown heavy as the armor encasing his superhuman frame. Immortality whispered to him, not of glory, but of accumulation. Victories stacked into cairns that could not warm numb hands, names added to ledgers that never closed. He had been created to serve as the bridge between his father's grand vision and its implementation across a million worlds. Yet perfection had become a prison whose bars were forged from expectations too vast for even a Primarch to bear. The Emperor's absence filled every chamber with precise imperial silence, a meticulous void where explanations should have lived. Loyalty, Horus thought, had once been a river flowing freely between father and son. Now it felt like a chain, and he could no longer tell whether he wore it or held it. Before him lay a shard of warded glass, its surface reflecting not one future but two, each as clear and inevitable as the other. In one reflection he knelt forever, eternally subservient, a gilded instrument in his father's cold design. In the other, he shattered that design entirely, becoming either liberator or destroyer, the distinction blurred beyond recognition. He lifted his hand toward the glass, and even the ship's servos listened in the hush, the dying suns dimmed by another fragile degree, uncertain whether to surrender or witness what came next. In that pause between motion and command, Horus felt the future approach like a blade seeking its sheath, knowing that whichever path he chose, it would cut deep, enough to scar the galaxy itself. Memory carried Horus back through the star-scattered years to Chthonia's hollowed depths, where tunnels breathed like sleeping metal beasts and children learned violence before words. The air had tasted of recycled dreams and spent promethium, while above their heads the hive city pressed down like a sleeping god's weight. Young Horus ruled those lightless depths with fists that knew only brutality, wearing a crude crown hammered from shell casings that cut his scalp until blood stiffened his hair. In those caverns the world was narrow, a rule, a fight, a hunger, and the ceiling creaked like divinity considering withdrawal. When the stranger came, he did not arrive but revealed himself, like dawn confessing it had always waited behind the horizon. The Emperor appeared as radiance walking beside silence, and boys who bore names made from threats found their knees without understanding why. That first touch transformed everything. The emperor's hand, closing around Horus's forearm, burned warmer than any torch in the tunnels, and for the first time in a life of counting debts, Horus felt a number that balanced itself. He learned the language of stars on decks that hummed like leviathan throats, his name spoken not as warning but promise, and the void, which had terrified cave-born eyes, became a cathedral whose windows were nebulae. There were lessons requiring no words, a hand on his shoulder after campaigns, pauses before reprimands as if love were a whetstone, used gently, shared silence when worlds surrendered and mercy weighed more than conquest. Around him, brotherhood crystallized from shared purpose. Ezekiel Abaddon stood at his right like iron drawn to lodestone, his devotion absolute as gravity itself, rage curved toward service. Little Horus Aximand listened more than spoke, sketching the margins of decisions with careful attention no one else possessed. Tarik Torgadon laughed so loudly even the engines remembered, his humour threading gold through war's dark fabric. Garville Loken held himself like a standard, planted in weather that never ceased, his integrity unshakable as bedrock. Together they became rhythm, an answer taught to the galaxy in increments of compliance and rebuilding. Horus's core motivation crystallized during those golden years, to serve as the bridge between his father's grand vision and his implementation across a million worlds, to hold the galaxy steady with both hands while the Emperor shaped humanity's destiny. He would be the interpreter between divine design and mortal reality, the steady presence that made impossible dreams achievable. Yet even in Triumph's brightest chambers, shadows learned the geography of his face. He watched his father's gaze turn toward terror, as though horizons beyond it cooled, and in that glance lay the loneliness of men who choose purposes larger than love. On distant Ulanor's horizon, victory banners snapped in alien winds, their colors bright as fresh blood. Horus tasted triumph that carried the bitter aftertaste of ash, not yet understanding that some victories are merely delayed defeats wearing borrowed crowns, or that the beautiful lie of certainty would soon crack beneath the weight of an empire built on foundations more fragile than faith. The triumph of Ulanor unfurled like a tapestry woven from starlight and conquest, 10,000 banners snapping in alien winds while the galaxy held its breath. Before assembled legions that stretched beyond horizons, the Emperor placed the Warmaster's crown upon Horus's brow, and in that moment the weight settled not upon his skull, but deep within his bones. First among equals, the title whispered, yet in those words lay the terrible mathematics of isolation. To be first meant to stand alone, and the cheering millions below became a sea of expectation that would never recede. Pride bloomed in his chest like molten gold, beautiful and burning, while beneath it something colder took root. The understanding that crowns worn in solitude grow heavier with each passing hour. His brother Primarchs offered congratulations that tasted of careful diplomacy wrapped in fraternal smiles. Perturabo's calculating gaze measured angles that had nothing to do with architecture, his approval precise as a blade's edge testing for weakness. Angron's fists clenched and unclenched in rhythm with some internal war, his congratulations delivered through gritted teeth that spoke of barely leashed envy. Fulgrim's perfection gleamed like polished armor, each gesture choreographed to convey friendship while revealing nothing of the ambition beneath. Even Sanguinius seemed distant, golden features carrying shadows that had not existed before the crown changed hands, as if elevation of one had somehow diminished all the rest. In the spaces between celebrations, new voices whispered counsel with honeyed understanding. Erebus appeared like a friend discovered in darkness, his words carrying sympathy for burdens that brothers could not comprehend. Lorgar spoke quietly of meaning beyond conquest, of worship as the natural response to greatness, and his sermons found empty chambers within Horus's heart that seemed disturbingly ready to be filled. The word-bearer's eyes held depths that reflected not light, but something older, hungrier, and when he smiled, the universe shifted slightly on its axis. The pageantry continued for days, fleets arrayed in perfect formation, compliance edicts binding 1,000 worlds, imperial eagles cast in gold and mounted on standards that would march to galaxy's edge. Yet beneath the triumph, Horus felt the growing architecture of isolation, each order given carved distance between himself and those who must obey, each decision another stone in the monument of solitude being erected around his throne. The external magnificence of empire contrasted sharply with the internal whisper of unworthiness that began to grow louder with each passing day. When the emperor announced his withdrawal to Terra for mysterious work that could not be shared, the crown's weight multiplied exponentially. That golden presence, which had warmed every corridor since Chthoniya, dimmed to memory, leaving a pressure change in the air like atmosphere fleeing a great hall. The galaxy suddenly felt vast as an ocean in which he alone must navigate without stars, and in the silence that followed the last fanfare, Horus discovered that power shared becomes bearable, but power held alone transforms into a prison whose bars are forged from the expectations of those who can never truly understand the cost of command. The campaign to Davin unfolded like a fever dream, written in blood and shadow, where ancient marshlands breathed with the accumulated whispers of forgotten gods, and the air itself tasted of rust and spiritual decay. The Serpent Lodge rose from a mound of bleached bones, its entrance carved with sigils that seemed to writhe even in still air, a temple hewn not by mortal hands, but by the patient gnawing of time and darker influences. Within those cursed depths, braziers burned with light that behaved like liquid shadow, pooling against flagstones worn smooth by millennia of blasphemous worship, while relics that remembered hands long turned to dust watched with eyeless sockets. There, cradled in blackened silk like a sleeping viper, lay the anathema, a blade whose edge seemed to drink light and memory alike, patient as a winter sea, untroubled by the slow drift of empires as it waited for a worthy vein. When destiny guided Horus's hand toward that cursed weapon, it struck with the intimacy of a long-promised kiss, delivering poison compounded not merely of venom, but of prophecy and corrupted truth. The Warmaster fell like a monument learning mortality, his immortal blood becoming a conduit between past, present, and futures that writhed with monstrous possibility. As consciousness flickered like a candle in surgical wind, Lorgar and Erebus appeared as shadows mistaken for salvation, offering sanctuary not in Medici bays, but in realms constructed from dream and dark sacrament. They guided his fevered spirit through corridors that existed only between heartbeats, where architecture obeyed laws older than physics, and the emperor appeared not as the golden father who had lifted him from Chthoniya's depths, but as a tyrant of cold logic who viewed his sons as instruments rather than heirs. The vision unfolded with terrible clarity. Terra transformed into a monument to sterile perfection, where primarchs stood in eternal ranks like gilded statues, their individuality burned away by the acid of absolute obedience, their voices silenced except to echo their father's will. Horus saw himself among them, his crown revealed as a collar, his authority as elaborate slavery, his love as the most sophisticated form of imprisonment ever devised. In this fever palace, he encountered a shadow self who spoke with his voice but carried different scars, wounds inflicted not by enemies, but by the slow erosion of accepting that love and servitude could wear identical faces. The internal conflict sharpened to a razor's edge that cut through every certainty he had cherished since childhood. Was obedience truly loyalty, or merely the methodical erasure of the self? Could devotion exist without equality, or did every act of submission carve away another piece of the soul until nothing remained but an echo shaped like a man? The whispers promised freedom, power, and truth unvarnished by paternal deceit, while his heart beat a rhythm caught between the love he felt and the betrayal he now perceived. Somewhere in the darkness between life and death, between loyalty and rebellion, his heartbeat approached a threshold that would transform it either into silence forever or into a war drum that would echo across the galaxy for 10,000 years. Horus emerged from the shadowed haze of fever as if surfacing through alien waters, the light around him strange and unfamiliar, every sound carrying new undertones of purpose and finality, though the wounds in his flesh had been sealed with surgical precision. Something deeper within him had been carved open, a chasm where certainty once lay. The air in the apothecarian was dense with murmured prayers and the muted clicks of machinery. But beneath these lay another current, whispers of transformation that clung to the walls and brushed against Horus's thoughts with insistent, chilling intimacy. When he spoke, his words resonated with a gravity none had heard before. He told his captains that his ordeal on Davin had revealed a future where unity was a gilded lie, and immortality a curse that chained sons to a father's impossible design. Duty, he declared, must transcend obedience, and love for humanity required the courage to act not as instruments, but as architects of their own fate. The conviction in his voice was not born of hatred, but of a cold, sorrowful necessity, a salvation that demanded sacrifice and a terrible new clarity. As Horus rose, the very deck plates of the vengeful spirit seemed to tilt beneath him, acknowledging the emergence of a new center around which his legion would now revolve. The transformation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as armorers arrived with pigments that drank the light, recasting the lunar wolves white and grey into a deep, abyssal green. The proud wolf's head, symbol of an older brotherhood, was peeled from ceramite like dead skin and replaced by the single, unblinking eye of Horus, a mark of vigilance, defiance, and the weight of destiny shouldered alone. On parade decks, banners were unstitched and reborn, drums thumped a rhythm that felt at once ancient and unfamiliar, and with a single breath the name Lunar Wolves was consigned to the past. Sons of Horus, the ship declared, as if the new name had always been waiting, unspoken, for this moment. Within the Mournival, the transformation revealed fractures long hidden beneath unity. Abaddon stepped forward, his loyalty reforged and absolute, ready to conquer whatever battlefield his gene father chose. Aximand, haunted by the cold touch of prophecy, could not abandon Horus, though fear now shaded every word and gesture. Torgadon, once the heart of laughter, searched Horus's eyes for the old spark of mischief and found only the wintry light of conviction. His humor returned, but cautious, as if testing the strength of thin ice. Loken listened longest, his silence heavy with the knowledge that the brotherhood he cherished was being rewritten into something both magnificent and monstrous, his agreement shaped more by grief than duty. The word-bearers, led by Lorgar, moved through the fleet like a fever, their whispered blessings and cryptic scriptures igniting new fires in the shadows. Lorgar's presence was both comfort and threat, his words pressing upon Horus's new faith with the promise that meaning must be claimed and defended, even at the cost of the world. Alone in his strategium, Horus drafted orders in a script that glittered like frost across glass, doctrines of necessity that would demand terrible grace. He signed them with a name that once bound him to his father, but now felt foreign, sealing them as if to smother doubt, and withheld their release, knowing the moment to unleash them would come soon enough. In the silence that followed, Horus contemplated the nature of immortality and meaning. He whispered to himself that endless life without purpose is a prison, and if liberation meant becoming the very force that shattered all he once held sacred, it was a price he would pay. The transformation was complete, the path chosen, but the full weight of what had begun would only become clear in the dark days to follow. Istvan the Threr sang its death song beneath a dome of glass and poison, the life-eater virus falling soft as winter's first snow, drifting over spires and sanctums with the false gentleness of mercy. From the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Horus watched entire cities grow quiet with deliberate, horrifying slowness, their lights dimming one by one until continents became graveyards mapped in darkness. The virus moved with patient thoroughness, seeping through hab blocks and cathedral spires, finding every breath and claiming it, transforming billions into monuments of perfect, terrible silence. Children's laughter ceased mid-note, lovers' whispers dissolved into chemical wind, and even the great war machines fell still as their operators became part of the grey dust that settled like ash over everything they had once protected. Below on the planet's surface, loyalist Astartes, who had been marked for death, fought with desperate fury, their understanding of betrayal complete, but their comprehension of its scope still dawning like a cold sun. Garviel Loken's voice crackled through vox channels, steady as bedrock even as his world crumbled, calling out coordinates and rallying points with unshakable integrity that had once made Horus proud to name him son. Tarek Torgadon's laughter flickered through static like a candle in surgical wind, growing dimmer with each passing hour, his humor transforming into something harder and more desperate as he realized the joke, this time, was on all of them. From orbit, Horus observed the extermination, with an expression unreadable even to himself, his perfect features carved from marble that had learned to feel pain. Part of him searched desperately for relief in the finality of his choice, hoping action would cauterize the doubts that had festered since Davin, while another part catalogued each death as evidence of a transformation he could not undo. The internal war raging within him had become psychological geography that could be mapped and measured. He systematically redrew himself to fit the choice he had made, discovering that some corners of his soul refused to be smoothed or reformed, remaining jagged and raw despite his efforts. The aftermath revealed a battlefield populated entirely by ghosts, where wind carried voices that would never speak again, and shadows fell in patterns that remembered the living. Great cities had become tombs, whose architecture preserved the final moments of their inhabitants, and even the sky seemed stained by what it had witnessed. Horus stood at the viewport, his reflection superimposed over the dead world below, wondering if this was what victory looked like when stripped of all illusion. Not triumph, but methodical erasure of everything that had once given meaning to struggle. Then, impossibly, through the vengeful spirit's communications array, a message pulsed with stubborn rhythm of hearts that refused to stop beating. The words cut through static like a blade through silk, simple and defiant, and carrying weight of hope that should have been impossible. Across the bridge, the signal strengthened, threading up through flames and vacuum like a needle remembering cloth, and the message resolved with crystalline clarity: we are not dead yet. The drop site massacre at Istvan Faith unfolded as a cathedral of betrayal, constructed in a single, terrible day, where the sky became an anvil and loyalty, the hammer that would shatter against treachery's unyielding surface. Ferrus Manus descended through storm-black clouds like righteousness given flesh, his iron hands following in perfect formation, while Korak struck with the grace of knives cutting through shadow, and Vulcan salamanders brought cleansing fire to what they believed would be their brother's redemption. The Loyalist legions spread across the killing ground in textbook deployment, their banners bright against the ashen ridges, unaware that salvation itself had been weaponized against them. Then the second wave revealed its true heraldry in muzzle flare and calculated massacre. What had arrived as reinforcement opened fire with the precision of a surgeon's blade, and the plain became a ledger rewritten in blood. Perturabo's war machines sang their iron hymns of destruction, each shell calculated not merely to kill, but to erase hope itself from the battlefield. Fulgrim's eyes shone with unnatural light as he met Ferrus in combat, brother against brother, while the world listened like a witness sworn to secrecy, their duel ending with the intimate thunder of adamantine meeting serpent's whisper. Angron's laughter had been stripped of every trace of joy, becoming a sound like breaking glass that cut through the screams of the dying. Korax learned the true shape of despair as his Raven Guard were caught in perfect crossfire, while Vulcan disappeared into myth and legend amid flames that would burn in memory long after the ashes cooled. From orbit, Horus watched his carefully orchestrated plans unfold with dreadful precision, each act of treachery catalogued like entries in a ledger, where the ink was human blood and the currency was brotherhood transformed into ash. Victory tasted of metal and ashes, each successful maneuver adding weight to a crown that had become too heavy for even his superhuman neck to bear. His internal narration revealed desperate attempts to convince himself that the old bonds had never truly existed, that this was necessary, a brutal amputation to save humanity from tyrannical design. Yet his hands shook despite superhuman control, and something fundamental trembled within him like a foundation discovering it had been built on sand. The symbolism accumulated with prophetic weight as mountains collapsed like broken oaths, their ancient stone crumbling under the pressure of so much concentrated betrayal. The very earth seemed to recoil from the magnitude of treachery, opening chasms that swallowed evidence of brotherhood while leaving scars visible from orbit. Storm-black clouds nailed themselves to the horizon like a funeral shroud drawn across hope itself. As the slaughter reached its crescendo, Horus stood amid trophies that could not warm the growing cold in his heart, finally understanding that from this height there was no path back down that wasn't paved with the bones of those he had once loved. The massacre ended not with triumph, but with terrible silence of a choice that could never be unmade. In that quiet, he gave the order that would decide an age: make ready for terror. The ruined storm tore the galaxy apart like a wound that refused to heal, transforming night into a tangible substance that devoured light and hope with equal hunger, while the map of stars that had once lain open like a promise folded into a maze of thorns and broken oaths. Across this psychic tempest, Horus spoke to his traitor brothers through channels carved from nightmare and necessity, their voices arriving thin and distorted like confessions murmured in the ruins of a chapel. Mortarian's words carried bone-deep disgust with his own existence, each syllable a testament to how immortality could become the most exquisite form of suffering ever devised, his contempt tasting of bitter metal and accumulated despair. Perturabo responded with the cold arithmetic of siege warfare, counting costs aloud until numbers became a dirge, his mechanical precision masking the bitter satisfaction he felt watching the Imperium's grand architecture crumble under methodical pressure. Fulgrim's transmissions sparkled with delighted cruelty, his perfect voice describing atrocities with the enthusiasm of an artist discussing his masterpiece, laughing with a mouthful of glass, while beneath the beauty lay something that had forgotten how to feel anything but the exquisite pleasure of causing pain. Lorgar's sermons drifted through the warp-touched vox like incense made from burned prayers, speaking of meaning discovered in the embrace of powers older than reason. His pious hunger for purpose finally fed by entities that demanded worship with the authenticity of genuine divinity. The word-bearer's faith had found its true object, and in that discovery lay both vindication and damnation, his words carrying weight that bent reality around their edges. Through these conversations, Horus felt the architecture of his rebellion solidifying into something larger than personal grievance. Yet each exchange revealed how the storm made them all smaller and less human. The same alchemy working on him, shaving away softer edges until only intent remained. The internal battle within Horus sharpened with each passing year, having embraced a path he named necessity, only to discover that necessity was a demanding master requiring ever greater sacrifice. He abandoned sleep as an obsolete indulgence and rationed silence like a strategic resource, systematically discarding the anchors of his humanity, the old codes of honor that had seemed so absolute on Chthonia, the gentle words that had once passed between father and son, even the mortal need for rest that had provided respite from command's weight. Each abandoned virtue was replaced by something harder and more efficient, yet the transformation felt less like evolution and more like methodical erasure of everything that had made him recognizably himself. The whispers of the dark gods grew stronger, no longer content to offer counsel, but beginning to demand payment for services rendered, their voices threading through his thoughts like silk wires that tightened with each decision. Within his own legion, the first seeds of betrayal against Horus himself began to flower like poisonous blooms in carefully tended soil. A cabal of captains, led by those who had embraced Chaos's gifts most completely, whispered among themselves that their Primarch lacked the ruthlessness necessary to achieve the future promised by their new patrons. They saw his moments of reflection, his fleeting pauses before ordering atrocities, as weaknesses rather than echoes of a soul struggling against oblivion, speaking of half-measures and sentiment that might doom their cause. These murmurs carried bitter irony. Horus, having learned to betray, was now learning what it meant to be betrayed in turn, the lesson arriving with surgical precision when he could least afford division in his ranks. The march toward terror was measured not in astronomical units, but in burned calendars and toppled statues, dissolved in seas of glass, each world conquered, adding another verse to a hymn of destruction that echoed across the galaxy. Horus began to understand that victory and damnation could wear identical faces, that the future he fought to create might be indistinguishable from the tyranny he sought to overthrow. The symbolism accumulated like gathering storm clouds. Bridges burned behind him, while new ones were constructed ahead from bones and broken promises, each step forward requiring him to step on the grave of something he had once held sacred. He built monuments from the ruins of compliance, leaving behind a trail of desolation that stretched across the galaxy like a scar that would never heal. In the quiet moments between campaigns, when even the warp-touched machinery hummed with exhausted rhythm, Horus contemplated the mathematics of immortality and the price of meaning. He had sought to escape the prison of endless servitude, only to discover that rebellion, too, could become a cage whose bars were forged from the expectations of those who followed him into darkness. The crown of the Warmaster had become the collar of the arch-traitor, and the weight remained exactly the same, though it now cut in different places and left different scars, each choice mortgaging another piece of the future he claimed to save. The siege of terror began not with thunder, but with the slow eclipse of hope itself, as Horus's armada emerged from the ruin storm like a cancer materializing in the void above humanity's birthworld. The vengeful spirit positioned itself over the imperial palace with deliberate malice, a black moon pregnant with 10,000 years of accumulated grief and betrayal, its scarred hull bearing witness to every world burned in the name of liberation. From the observation deck, Horus gazed down at the throne world spread beneath him, like a map of everything he had once sworn to protect. The palace's golden spires catching the last light of Terra's dying sun, while defensive batteries turned skyward, like flowers seeking illumination that would never come. The sight stirred something within him that might once have been called love, now transformed into the recognition that some beauties could only be preserved through destruction, like pressing flowers between pages of a book that would never again be opened. The orbital bombardment commenced with Perturabo's methodical precision, each strike calculated not merely to wound, but to demonstrate the mathematics of despair written in the language of selective annihilation. Iron Warrior's artillery sang hymns of architectural destruction, reducing entire districts to geometric patterns of rubble while leaving others untouched, creating a canvas of suffering that would be remembered long after the last human voice fell silent. Mortarian's plague winds drifted through breached sectors like prayers spoken in reverse, carrying diseases that remembered every world they had touched, transforming the very air into an enemy that could not be fought with blade or bolt. The symbolism accumulated with prophetic weight. The towering walls that had once proclaimed humanity's ascension now served as monuments to its folly, while the golden throne, symbol of divine authority, awaited transformation into a prison for a dying god. Yet even as victory seemed assured, the poison of betrayal that Horus had introduced to the galaxy began to turn inward upon itself with surgical precision. Within his own legion, the cabal of captains who had embraced Chaos's gifts most completely whispered in shadowed corners that their Primarch's strategic patience masked weakness, that his occasional reluctance to unleash total annihilation revealed sentiment that might doom their cause. They craved faster, bloodier resolution, complete obliteration that would leave no doubt about the new order, and their eyes followed Horus with calculating hunger that reminded him uncomfortably of his own gaze when first contemplating rebellion. Abaddon stood at his right, like a drawn sword that had forgotten rest, his loyalty absolute, but increasingly strained by the competing voices that demanded swifter action. Malagos, twisted and faithful, offered counsel measured in lives and symbols, while Axeman spoke quietly of the legion's fraying edges, of warriors who wore new sigils beneath their plates and dreamed in languages the Imperium had outlawed. The dark gods whispered constantly now, their voices threading through Horus's thoughts like silk wires that tightened with each decision, promising apotheosis and demanding payment in currencies he was only beginning to understand. They spoke of transformation beyond the merely physical, of becoming something that could reshape reality according to will, rather than accepting limitations imposed by lesser beings who mistook mortality for virtue. Yet beneath their honeyed promises lay hunger vast as the void between stars, and Horus began to suspect that he was not their chosen champion, but merely their latest meal, prepared with exquisite care over the course of centuries. The internal transformation accelerated as the siege deepened. Each atrocity committed carving away another piece of the man who had once shared quiet laughter with Torgadon and basked in his father's approval between campaigns. Below in the palace, defenders moved with desperate efficiency, their courage magnificent and futile as candles lit in a hurricane. Rogel Dawn's voice echoed through vox channels with the steady rhythm of bedrock refusing to break, while Sanguinius walked the walls like an angel learning mortality, his golden presence a beacon that drew both hope and despair in equal measure. The blood angels fought with fury that transcended mere anger, their red armor bright as fresh wounds against the grey dust of a dying world, and Horus felt their defiance like a physical weight pressing against his chest. As the siege ground toward its inevitable climax, Horus began to understand that victory and damnation were not opposite outcomes, but different names for the same destination. The future he fought to create looked increasingly indistinguishable from the tyranny he claimed to oppose, built on foundations of fear and worship rather than love and understanding. He had sought to break chains of servitude, only to forge new ones from ambition and necessity, discovering that revolution could become its own form of imprisonment when pursued with sufficient dedication. In the quiet hours between assaults, when even the screaming stopped and only his own breathing marked time's passage, Horus contemplated the mathematics of choice and consequence, wondering if the final confrontation approaching would bring liberation, or merely exchange one form of bondage for another, dressed in different colors but weighing exactly the same. The siege reached its crescendo like a symphony conducted by the gods of war themselves, as the imperial palace's outer defenses crumbled beneath artillery that had learned to speak in the ancient tongues of destruction and despair. Each shell that struck the golden walls carried with it the accumulated weight of 1,000 betrayals, while the very air above terror thickened with psychic pressure that made reality buckle at its edges like parchment held too close to flame. Sanguinius stood upon the eternity gate like a statue carved from pure defiance, his wings spread against the smoke-darkened sky as if he could shelter the entire throne world beneath their span, and even the traitor legions felt his presence like a gravitational pull that reminded them of brotherhood they had willingly discarded. The angel's light burned through the miasma of the siege with such intensity that some of Horus's own warriors paused mid-charge, their genetic memory whispering of bonds that had once seemed eternal, of laughter shared in the void between stars when the galaxy was young and full of promise. From his command throne aboard the vengeful spirit, Horus watched the unfolding devastation with eyes that had learned to see too much, his perfect features now bearing the weight of choices that could never be unmade. The dark gods pressed closer, with each passing hour, their whispers no longer content to offer counsel, but demanding immediate action with the urgency of creditors come to collect overdue debts. They spoke of transformation that awaited beyond the final threshold, of apotheosis that would remake him into something beyond the crude limitations of flesh and doubt. Yet their promises carried undertones of hunger so vast it made the void between galaxies seem intimate by comparison. With crystalline clarity that arrived like a blade between ribs, Horus began to understand that he was not their chosen champion, but their most elaborate feast, prepared over centuries with exquisite patience, seasoned with betrayal, and marinated in the blood of worlds until every fiber of his being had absorbed the flavor of damnation. The atmosphere within the vengeful spirit had grown thick with tension that could be tasted like copper pennies dissolved in wine, as his own sons watched him with calculations that ran deeper than devotion. The cabal of captains who had embraced chaos most completely whispered in shadowed alcoves about their Primarch's moments of hesitation, interpreting his brief pauses before ordering atrocities as weakness rather than the death throes of a soul fighting against complete dissolution. They craved total annihilation, absolute victory that would leave no ambiguity about the new order's supremacy, and their impatience pressed against Horus's awareness like hungry mouths seeking sustenance. Even Abaddon's loyalty, once as reliable as the turning of worlds, now carried weight that felt more like burden than comfort. Another expectation to be met when all expectations had become chains forged from the hopes of those who followed him into darkness. Below in the palace's labyrinthine depths, the loyalist resistance continued to defy every calculation of despair, their stubborn refusal to yield gnawing at the edges of Horus's carefully constructed certainty. Rogel Dawn's voice echoed through vox channels with the steady rhythm of bedrock that had chosen to speak, each defensive position a mathematical proof written in ceramite and devotion, while Jagatai Khan's white scars struck like lightning given purpose and vanished before retaliation could find them. The sheer, irrational persistence of their hope began to feel like an accusation, a reminder that some things could not be conquered through superior force alone, that faith could be more durable than adamantium when tested in the furnace of absolute desperation. Terror itself seemed to rebel against the siege, as if the throne world's very stones remembered oaths sworn in humanity's golden dawn and refused to accept their breaking. Ancient pacts stirred in the palace's foundations like sleeping giants awakening to defend their charge, while the golden throne pulsed with energies that made reality hiccup around its edges, and the Astronomican's light flickered like a dying star that refused to surrender its final breath. Horus felt these forces pressing against his consciousness with the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of human dreams, aspirations crystallized into psychic architecture that recognized his presence as infection and mobilized every antibody of hope to resist him. As the siege ground toward its inevitable conclusion, Horus began to perceive the true shape of the trap that had been closing around him, since Davin's cursed blade first whispered promises in his ear. He had sought to escape the prison of eternal servitude, only to discover that rebellion, too, could become a cage whose bars were forged from the expectations of followers and the demands of powers that viewed mortal concerns as fleeting entertainment. The crown of the Warmaster had become the collar of the arch-traitor, cutting in different places, but leaving scars of identical depth, and in the growing darkness between assaults, he finally understood that some paths, once chosen, lead only to destinations that cannot be reached without becoming someone else entirely. The Eternity Gate fell with the sound of thunder learning to weep, its ancient mechanisms screaming in protest as 10,000 years of defiance crumbled beneath the concentrated fury of gods who had grown tired of waiting for mortal resolution. Sanguinius stood in the breach like a pillar of light carved from pure determination, His wings spread wide against the advancing darkness, as if he could shelter all of terror beneath their golden span. And even the traitor legions hesitated before such radiant defiance that made their corruption feel suddenly heavy and unwelcome. The angel's blade sang hymns older than memory, as it carved through power armor and corrupted flesh with equal ease, each stroke a prayer written in the language of absolute conviction, while his presence burned through the psychic miasma of the siege, like a star refusing to acknowledge that night had fallen across the galaxy. Yet beneath his luminous exterior, those who possessed the sight to perceive it could sense the weight of prophecy pressing down like a mountain balanced on the edge of a blade. For Sanguinius knew the shape of his own ending, had seen it written in dreams that tasted of blood and sorrow, and still he fought with fury that made the very air around him sing with defiance against fate itself. The vengeful spirit descended through terror's atmosphere like a falling cathedral, its hull scarred by wars that had raged across the galaxy's width, carrying within its belly the accumulated weight of every choice that had led to this moment of ultimate reckoning. Horus felt the ship's machine spirit respond to his presence with something approaching reverence, its ancient systems recognizing the approach of destiny with mechanical precision that transcended mere programming, while through the vessel's sensors he perceived terror spread beneath him like a wounded animal that refused to die despite mortal injuries. The imperial palace's golden spires still caught light, despite the smoke and ash that choked the sky, their defiance a mirror of his own stubborn refusal to yield, and for a heartbeat that lasted forever, Horus felt the full weight of what he was about to destroy pressing against his consciousness like a physical burden. Within the vengeful spirit's corridors, tension had grown thick enough to taste like copper pennies dissolved in wine, as his own sons watched him with calculations that ran deeper than devotion or duty. The cabal of captains who had embraced chaos most completely whispered in shadowed alcoves about their Primarch's moments of hesitation, interpreting his brief pauses before ordering atrocities as weakness rather than the death throes of a soul fighting against complete dissolution into something unrecognizable. When they came to him in the engine crypts, arranged like a constellation around a circle of knives and mirrors, their spokesman offered a chalice whose surface crawled with living script, promising transformation beyond the merely physical. For a heartbeat, the Warmaster saw himself reflected on 1,000 tiny planes, each showing a different version of apotheosis. Yet when he took the chalice and set it gently on the floor between them, the ship itself seemed to hold its breath. He crushed it beneath his boot, and when the shards sang, he heard the first word he had ever spoken in Chthonia's tunnels, echoing across the decades. The reprimand was not thunder, but the slow withdrawal of warmth as he stripped them of rank and sent them to the most lethal fronts, not as sacrifice to hungry gods, but as penance, measured in days they might never see. The dark gods pressed closer, with each passing hour, their whispers no longer content to offer counsel, but demanding immediate payment for services rendered across decades of careful corruption, speaking of transformation that would remake him into something capable of reshaping reality according to will, rather than accepting limitations imposed by lesser beings. Yet beneath their honeyed promises lay hunger so vast, it made the void between galaxies seem intimate by comparison, and with crystalline clarity that arrived like ice forming in his veins, Horus understood that he was not their chosen champion, but their most elaborate meal, prepared with exquisite patience over centuries, seasoned with betrayal and marinated in the blood of worlds until every fiber of his being had absorbed the flavor of damnation. The realization brought not despair but a cold satisfaction, the understanding that even gods could be disappointed if their feast chose to spoil itself at the crucial moment. From his command throne, Horus looked into the shard of warded glass he kept by his console, the old omen from a calmer age when choices seemed clearer and consequences more distant, seeing two futures reflected with perfect clarity. In one, orbital fire ended everything that could still be forgiven, reducing terror to ash and memory while leaving him victorious but eternally hollow. In the other, a doorway opened and footsteps sounded behind him that belonged to the only beings who could still call him son and wound him by doing so, offering either absolution through combat or damnation through victory. Abaddon urged annihilation with the certainty of a drawn sword that had forgotten peace, while Malagos counselled patience made of razor wire. And Aximan asked in a whisper if there remained any road back that was not paved with broken truths and the bones of those who had trusted him. The galaxy outside dimmed, as if the suns themselves had grown tired of deciding who deserved their light, and the drums in Horus's blood slowed to match a heartbeat not his own, one he had chased and fled since the day a golden hand had lifted him from Chthonia's dust and offered him a sky larger than dreams. He realized then that victory and defeat were costumes sewn to the same body, that the only honest act left to him was to demand an answer from the source that had never truly answered his deepest questions about love, duty, and the price of immortal purpose. The decision crystallized like frost forming on a window, beautiful and inevitable, and sharp enough to cut anyone who touched it carelessly. He raised his hand above the command dais, and the runes answered with soft, eager radiance, promising catastrophe and clarity in the same breath, while across the deck the veterans of 1,000 wars turned as one toward the moment their lives had always been rushing toward like moths drawn to flame. The words came quietly, with the weight of finality that transforms whispers into earthquakes that reshape continents. The shields fell like curtains drawn back from a stage where the final act would determine whether the performance ended in tragedy or transcendence. And in the sudden vulnerability of his flagship, Horus extended his invitation to destiny itself, knowing that whoever answered would bring with them the resolution he had sought since the first moment doubt had whispered in his ear that love and slavery might wear identical faces. The invitation hung in the void like a challenge, written in the language of falling shields and dimmed weapons, while across Terra's scarred surface, Sanguinius lifted his golden head from the carnage at the Eternity Gate, his prescient sight piercing through layers of possibility to perceive the moment approaching like a tide that could not be turned. The angel's wings spread wide as he prepared to answer a summons that tasted of brotherhood corrupted and love transformed into the sharpest blade ever forged, knowing that some invitations could only be declined at the cost of watching everything burn from a distance, measured in cowardice rather than wisdom. Within the imperial palace's deepest sanctums, ancient packs stirred like sleeping giants awakening to defend their charge, while the golden throne pulsed with energies that made reality hiccup around its edges, and somewhere in the warded darkness, the emperor paused in labors that had consumed years of concentration, his golden presence flickering like a candle touched by wind that carried the scent of approaching storm. The teleportarium aboard the vengeful spirit hummed with energies older than the Imperium, its mechanisms singing hymns in the machine tongue, while reality bent around focal points that served as doorways between one heartbeat and the next. Horus stood at the chamber's center like a statue carved from anticipation and regret, his perfect features bearing the accumulated weight of choices that had led inexorably to this moment of ultimate reckoning, while around him the ship's corridors echoed with the whispers of dark gods grown frantic with demands and promises that he now ignored with cold precision. The Warmaster's hands remained steady despite the magnitude of what he had set in motion. Yet beneath his tranquil exterior lay currents of emotions so complex they defied simple naming. Love and hatred braided together until they became indistinguishable, hope and despair dancing to the same rhythm. The desperate need for understanding wrapped around the terrible certainty that some questions could only be answered through violence that would echo across eternity. When Sanguinius materialized in the teleportarium's harsh light, he appeared not as the angel of vengeance his enemies expected, but as the brother Horus remembered from quieter days when the galaxy seemed infinite with possibility rather than finite with consequences. His armor bore the scars of the siege like prayers written in ceramite and blood, while his wings spread behind him in a display that managed to be both magnificent and heartbreaking, a reminder of beauty that had chosen to stand against the tide of corruption rather than seek accommodation with powers that promised easier paths. For a moment that lasted forever, the two Primarchs regarded each other across a distance, measured not in meters, but in the accumulated weight of betrayals and broken oaths, each seeing in the other's face the reflection of roads not taken and choices that could never be unmade. The conversation that followed moved through layers of meaning like a blade, seeking the heart of truth buried beneath years of careful lies and necessary deceptions. Sanguinius spoke of duty that transcended personal desire, of love that could endure even the complete transformation of its object, while his prescient sight showed him glimpses of futures spreading like branches from this moment, most leading to darkness, but a few carrying light that might survive even the death of hope itself. Horus answered with words that carried the accumulated weight of isolation and the terrible clarity that came from standing alone at the center of galactic transformation, speaking of chains disguised as crowns and servitude dressed in the language of filial devotion, his voice carrying undertones of pain so profound it made the ship's hull creak in sympathy. The duel began not with the clash of weapons, but with the slow recognition that some conversations could only be concluded through violence that served as both question and answer. Each strike a word in a language older than speech, each parry a response to accusations that cut deeper than any blade ever forged. Sanguinius fought with the fury of someone defending not merely a cause, but the memory of what they had all been before choices carved them into shapes that could no longer fit together, while Horus wielded his blade like a pen writing the final chapter of a story that had begun in hope and would end in whatever lay beyond the horizon of forgiveness. The angel's precognitive abilities showed him the shape of his own ending approaching like a tide that could not be turned, yet he fought with undiminished intensity, each moment of resistance a gift offered to futures he would never see. When Sanguinius fell, his wings spread beneath him like a carpet woven from light and sorrow. Horus knelt beside his brother's still form and wept without producing tears, understanding finally that some victories were indistinguishable from defeats and that the price of transformation was always paid in currencies that could never be replaced. In the silence that followed, footsteps echoed through the ship's corridors with the weight of approaching judgment, and Horus rose to face the final confrontation, knowing that whoever came to answer his invitation would bring with them either absolution or annihilation. and that he was no longer certain there remained any meaningful distinction between the two. The Emperor stepped onto the vengeful spirit like dawn entering a mausoleum, his presence transforming corridors swollen with warp pressure into something approaching sacred space, while reality itself seemed to straighten beneath the weight of divinity, walking among mortals who had forgotten how to kneel. The ship's machine spirit fell silent in recognition of power that transcended mere physicality, its ancient systems acknowledging the approach of their creator's creator, with mechanical reverence mixed with terror, while even the vessel's hull sang funeral hymns in frequencies only gods could hear. Where he passed, corrosion retreated like shadows, fleeing sunrise. Lights remembered their purpose, and the deck rang with the inevitability of judgment approaching on golden feet that had walked across the birth and death of civilizations without ever growing weary of their burden. Horus stood before his father, like a monument carved from choices that could never be unmade, his perfect form bearing the accumulated weight of betrayals and transformations that had reshaped him into something simultaneously magnificent and monstrous, while around them the chamber where Sanguinius lay broken seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of words that would either heal or complete the galaxy's fracturing. The Warmaster's hands remained steady despite the magnitude of what approached, yet his eyes carried depths that reflected not light, but the accumulated darkness of a soul that had chosen understanding over innocence, and when he spoke, his voice carried undertones of pain so profound it made the very air weep in sympathy for what had been lost between them. The conversation that followed transcended mere dialogue, becoming instead a war between competing philosophies made flesh, each word weighted with the gravity of choices that would echo across millennia, while the dark gods pressed closer, with hunger so vast it made the void between galaxies seem intimate by comparison. Horus spoke of the terrible loneliness that came with immortality, stretched beyond mortal comprehension, of love that felt indistinguishable from imprisonment when offered without equality or understanding, of expectations that transformed even the most cherished relationships into elaborate forms of servitude dressed in familial language. He accused his father of viewing his sons not as heirs, but as instruments, created to serve purposes they were never permitted to fully understand, their devotion harvested like a resource to fuel ambitions that stretched beyond their capacity to meaningfully contribute toward. The Emperor's response came through compassion so profound that Horus could not bear to survive its touch, a love that acknowledged every accusation while simultaneously demonstrating that understanding and forgiveness could coexist with the necessity of cosmic responsibility, that shepherding humanity's evolution across millennia required choices that appeared cruel from limited perspectives, but served purposes that transcended individual fulfillment. In that moment of perfect clarity, Horus saw himself reflected in his father's eyes not as the corrupted thing he had become, but as the beloved son he had always been, and the recognition struck him with force greater than any physical blow, revealing the true shape of the trap that had closed around him since the moment he first chose doubt over faith. Through the storm of revelation, Horus reached toward the shard of warded glass that had followed him from his sanctum, its surface reflecting not one future, but infinite possibilities spreading like branches from this moment of ultimate choice. The dark gods screamed their demands through channels carved from nightmare and necessity, promising apotheosis and threatening dissolution in the same breath, while somewhere in the depths of his transformed soul, the boy from Chthoniya, who had first felt a father's gentle hand, whispered that some prices were too high regardless of what they purchased. Between redemption that would require acknowledging the magnitude of his errors and continuation down a path that could only end in mutual annihilation, Horus felt the weight of decision, approaching like a blade seeking its sheath. The strike that followed lasted only heartbeats, but contained within it the weight of entire civilizations, rising and falling, as Horus chose not the path of reconciliation that might have saved them both, but the darker road that would transform this moment from potential healing into inevitable tragedy. His talon rose with surgical precision, finding not his father's throat, but something more precious and fragile, the last bridge between them, represented by his own capacity for mercy, which he severed with deliberate finality. In that choice, he became truly lost, and the Emperor's expression shifted from hope to the terrible sadness of a parent watching their child choose damnation despite every offered alternative, understanding that love, too, could kill when it demanded more than the beloved could bear to give. The duel that followed transcended mere physical combat, becoming instead a conversation between competing visions of eternity written in the language of blades that remembered every throat they had kissed across millennia of service, while around them reality buckled like parchment held too close to flame as the dark gods pressed closer, with hunger so profound it transformed the very air into something thick and nourishing. Horus struck with fury that contained the accumulated weight of 10,000 unspoken grievances, each blow a question posed in the ancient tongue of violence about love that felt indistinguishable from elaborate imprisonment, while the Emperor responded with movements that carried the patient rhythm of cosmic forces grinding toward inevitable resolution, his blade singing hymns of necessity and sacrifice that made the ship's hull weep in recognition of truths too vast for mortal comprehension. Between strikes, words fell like drops of molten metal, each syllable weighted with the gravity of choices that had led inexorably to this moment of ultimate reckoning. Horus spoke of the terrible mathematics of immortality, of devotion harvested like a resource to fuel ambitions he was never permitted to fully understand, his voice carrying undertones of accusation that cut deeper than any physical wound, while his corruption battled against fragments of the sun who had once shared quiet laughter between campaigns. The Emperor's responses came not through argument, but through demonstration, each parry revealing layers of compassion so profound they made Horus stagger beneath their weight, love that acknowledged every grievance while simultaneously showing that understanding and forgiveness could coexist with the necessity of shepherding humanity's evolution across millennia that stretched beyond individual fulfillment. The chamber around them became a crucible where symbols collapsed into one another with devastating effect, breaking chains that had also served as lifelines, collapsing vaults that had provided shelter as well as imprisonment, while the sound of their weapons meeting echoed like thunder, speaking a father's name for what might be the final time. From a shattered archway, a lone imperial fist staggered forward, helmet lost, eyes bright with courage that knew its limits, the last pistol in his trembling hand raised like a prayer against impossibility itself. Horus, irritated by this interruption of destiny, unmade the mortal with a thought, writing hopelessness in red vapor across the air, and the Emperor flinched not from force but from desecrated bravery, the last, restraint within him, snapping like a wire, pulled beyond its breaking point. Light gathered without color, a radiance that remembered the first treaties, matter made with law, moving through the Emperor's hands like grief learning purpose, as he ceased to be merely a swordsman and became a verdict incarnate. false blessings peeled from Horus in shrieking layers as the dark gods recoiled like misers who suddenly smelled fire consuming their investments, snatching back their loans and leaving him naked of every miracle but one: the capacity to choose his own ending rather than have it imposed by powers that viewed him as elaborate entertainment. For an instant, the Warmaster stood revealed as he truly was beneath the corruption, looking suddenly young despite the crown that had grown heavy as a planet, and something like a smile searched for his mouth as understanding finally dawned. In the growing darkness between heartbeats, Horus glimpsed once more the shard of warded glass from his sanctum, its surface reflecting not two futures, but the single, inevitable path his choices had carved through possibility itself, and he finally recognized which hand had always been destined to be his. With crystalline clarity that arrived like ice forming in his veins, he understood that the trap had never been external, but internal, constructed from his own inability to accept that love could exist without requiring its recipient to become something other than what they were, that equality and servitude could wear identical faces when viewed through the lens of wounded pride. The Emperor's final strike came not as violence, but as mercy, wearing the mask of annihilation, a blow that served simultaneously as judgment and absolution, recognizing that Horus had become something that could neither be saved nor permitted to continue existing in its current form. The Warmaster felt his father's power washing through him like fire that burned away everything false while leaving only essential truth beneath, that he had been loved completely and had chosen to interpret that love as imprisonment, had been offered meaning and declared it insufficient because it came from another's hand rather than his own. As consciousness flickered like a candle touched by wind that carried the scent of approaching eternity, Horus experienced a moment of perfect clarity that contained within it both vindication and damnation, whispering words that might have been apology or accusation before darkness claimed him forever, their meaning lost in the growing distance between what he had been and what he would never be again. Aftermath arrived as a long, mournful echo that would resonate across 10,000 years of accumulated silence, while the siege loosened like a fist unclenching from a sword hilt grown too heavy to hold, and across Terra's scarred surface, ash drifted like exhausted snow over palaces that had learned new definitions of endurance. The vengeful spirit drifted in the void above, the throne world like a monument to choices that could never be unmade, its corridors filled with the whispers of ghosts who had discovered too late that some victories were indistinguishable from elaborate forms of suicide, while across the galaxy's width, the traitor legions scattered like sparks from a dying fire, carrying within their ranks the bitter knowledge that revolution, too, could become its own form of imprisonment when pursued with sufficient dedication. The Emperor's broken body was installed upon the golden throne, with ceremonies that felt more like funeral rites than coronation, his golden presence transformed from divine father into eternal function, immortality revealed not as gift, but as the most exquisite form of punishment ever devised by entities that understood the mathematics of suffering measured in millennia. What had been saved was not a man, but a beacon, not a father, but a fire that must never be allowed to die. The Astronomicans' light steadying as navigators across the galaxy felt blindfolds slip from eyes that had forgotten how to see hope without pain. The throne room's silence learned new depths as the master of mankind became the silent guardian. His consciousness expanded to encompass the psychic suffering of an entire species, while his dreams grew haunted by futures that might have been immortality transformed from blessing into endless, grinding labor that would consume years like grain in a mill that could never stop turning. Abaddon gathered the remnants of what had once been the lunar wolves with fury that resembled grief-wearing power armor, his devotion reforged in the crucible of his Gene Father's annihilation, while around him veterans of 1,000 campaigns struggled to understand how victory could taste so much like ash and defeat, wear such familiar faces. The sons of Horus painted over their eyes to hide what they had witnessed, renaming themselves the Black Legion, as if darkness could provide shelter from memories that cut deeper than any blade, their transformation serving as template for every ambition that would follow in the wake of such comprehensive betrayal. Across the Imperium, the Space Marine legions were broken into smaller chapters like swords shattered to prevent them from ever again cutting their wielders. The Codex Astartes becoming scripture written in blood and hard-won wisdom. Each regulation a prayer against repetition of horrors that had nearly consumed everything humanity had built across millennia of expansion and hope. Horus, unmade and scattered, existed now as memory and warning rather than presence, his essence preserved in fragments across dimensions that served as both punishment and cautionary tale, while the dark gods, disappointed in their feast, studied the anatomy of rebellion that had failed not through lack of will, but through excess of it. His name became curse and legend simultaneously, a whispered reminder that even the most beloved could become monsters, when, given authority without accountability, that love offered without understanding could curdle into the sharpest blade ever forged, leaving scars visible to those with eyes trained to perceive the places where devotion had transformed into elaborate imprisonment. The philosophical implications rippled outward like waves from stones dropped in still water, transforming how humanity understood the relationship between love and freedom, duty and servitude, the price of immortality and the cost of meaning discovered too late. Empire, they learned, was a promise that arrived with its own ending sewn into the fabric of its ambition, while betrayal revealed itself as love that could not endure the weight of imperfection, choosing honest damnation over comfortable servitude. The final images mirrored the opening, ash drifting over terror like exhausted snow, suns dimming as if drawing curtains across stages where the greatest tragedy ever performed had reached its inevitable conclusion, and a ruined palace that would endure longer than memory itself, carrying forward the echoes of choices that had rewritten the galaxy's destiny. The story closed not with answers, but with questions that would echo across eternity. If the price was always paid in full, what exactly had been purchased with such dear coin, and whether the universe that emerged from the flames was truly different from the one that had burned, or merely the same story told in different voices, wearing fresh scars but bearing identical wounds.